Station 51, engine 27, engine 32, truck 105.
You're listening to The Fire Break with Steve Wolf. Welcome back to The Fire Break. I'm Steve Wolf. As you undoubtedly know, The Fire Break is sponsored by Team Wildfire. Check it out on the web, teamwildfire.com. Well, this world of disasters, fires, floods, all of the usual plagues that one is subject to as part of living on this earth.
Chaos.
The chaos, yes. It generates a lot of response from first responders and then ultimately from insurance companies. But what I had no idea of was that there's this whole field called disaster law. And I've got Kendall Jarvis with us today, and Kendall is a disaster law expert. Kendall, welcome to the program. How are you today? Fingers up.
Thank you, Steve. Very good. I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
You bet. So what is this field of disaster law? What is all encompassed underneath that?
It is possible that I made this up. No, I'm just kidding. But seriously, it is possible that it is a very new reality. It's a very new reality where we used to kind of in the practice of law, people view things in silos. Like you go to an attorney because you have a specific issue and that one specific issue needs to be addressed, right? Disaster law attempts to look at things more holistically, like knowing you're going to be a survivor, you need to plan for something. And also like with county and government contracts, there's a whole array of things that come into play.
So what type of a client would hire a disaster lawyer? Is that a municipality or an insurance company or a class action of individuals who are impacted by a disaster? Who do you work for?
That is a good question. So let me say, when I started with my former executive director at Legal Aid of Sonoma County, Ronit Rubinoff, also my dear friend, when we started the disaster relief program there, we were pretty unsure of what we were doing in all reality. We were thinking like, of course, there's going to be needs related to immediate things like food, shelter, housing, right? So we were thinking like FEMA appeals, identifying vulnerabilities, landlord-tenant issues. But the more that we talked to people and the more we engaged with the community, the more apparent it became that this was like an entire array of issues, both from the start, but also from the trajectory that follows, right? So in the beginning, things like FEMA appeals can be very, very big topics. Like we know in LA, they're a huge topic right now. They've been a huge topic in Maui in the past few years. They have been a huge topic in Sonoma, Santa Cruz. I mean, obviously Florida, Texas, Oklahoma, the list goes on. But the reality is that was kind of the initial understanding, was that if you were doing something related to disasters, it was probably connected to FEMA appeals, which is true. That's accurate, valid. We all need to do that. We need to get better at having a stock of people that can help. But there's a secondary piece to it, which is what happens after that. Like FEMA is designed to really help people in a very specific sector of your community. It's like people who are the most vulnerable, they're not insured, they're precariously or unsafely housed as a result of the disaster. It was their primary residence, right? There are a lot of eligibility factors that go into that. But when you talk to a community at large, especially with our growing housing crisis, not to make this into a separate side podcast, but that becomes a major issue because what are the other pieces of the puzzle and how can we help people? So obviously insurance comes up very quickly. Landlord-tenant issues come up very quickly. I can't, from both sides, oddly, it's not just tenants that are like, hey, I need help. It's also landlords like, how do I navigate this space? What am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to do this? Because it's kind of an unwritten script, right? At least unless, like you've been in this field for a while, but for individuals that this is their first time being impacted by something, it is pretty serious and significant to identify the issues that come up. And one of the things that's odd about it is that we consistently ran into people that did not realize so many of these issues were legal issues. It was like, I have not necessarily needed to have an attorney before in my life, knock on wood. You're fortunate if that is true. Or I haven't needed to even have an advocate in my life. Either you've been able to do that yourself or it hasn't been necessary. Again, knock on wood, right? But when this comes up, you kind of need both. You need an advocate, you need a friend, you need a partner, you need an attorney, you need financial support, you need so many pieces of the puzzle. So a lot of this I always view as kind of 50-50-50, which I get is much more than 100%, right? But like half of it is emotional. That's a real toll that needs to be discussed. But the other half of it is financial and legal. And finding and resolving that gap financing piece comes enormously through legal avenues that people don't really think about until they're in that space. And I don't think a lot of attorneys even think about, due to what I said before, that like we're so trained to be like a specialist in a certain area rather than a broad area that impacts people in multiple spaces at multiple times.
So how do you replicate yourself really? When some of these disasters strike, you could have literally thousands of people impacted, and there's probably a lot of overlap in what they need, right? They all need to work through whatever the FEMA issues are. They all need to, hopefully find out that their insurance didn't get canceled 6 weeks before the fire, right? So how do you provide your service at scale?
I would say a few things. I would say number one, I don't want this to just be seen as a thing that only someone with a law degree can do or with as a licensed attorney. I think there are so many powerful examples of being an advocate, whether that's for yourself, for a friend or family member, or being out there in the community, being a disaster case manager. Those pieces of the puzzle really bring people the strength that they need at a very difficult time. So, like when we started the FEMA appeals process, well, let me back up. Big picture, there are certain things you definitely would need an attorney for, but there are a lot of basic things that people really, survivors really just need support for. And I think in a lot of situations that ends up being the basic starting point is like FEMA appeals, right? Like, what are you doing? Why are you doing it? What do you need to accomplish? And when we started the FEMA appeals clinic in Sonoma County initially, there was a giant question of like, who are we going to get to help us? How are we going to get people to help? Do they need to be attorneys? Do they not? And I realized in researching this issue at the time, that was the messaging that existed prior to 2017. It was, you have to be an attorney, you have to be an expert in FEMA appeals, you have to do this, you have to do that. And it was a bit terrifying. So there was kind of a lack of community support not because it didn't exist, but because there was a fear associated with that. Like, Steve, if I called you and said, come to my FEMA appeals clinic, be a FEMA appeals expert, you would be like, I don't know if I really want to do that, right? So the creative concept in that situation was like, hey, let's reframe this, right? Because at the basic end of the day, bottom line is that there is a very standard way to view FEMA appeals. For most situations, it's about gathering documentation and making the best argument you can in a given situation. Obviously, according to the regulations, there are a lot of tools that can be utilized to do that effectively without having gone to law school. So I would say that there are multiple iterations of disaster law. It's not just one thing at one time. But I do think that it's really important to encourage people to participate in this space. And whoever you are, if you're an advocate, if you're that person that's like, this seems unfair, this seems unreasonable, I would say if you're a good person, it probably is unfair, probably is unreasonable, and there's likely a legal solution or an advocate solution.
So you talked about this concept of the FEMA appeal several times, and I'm neither a lawyer nor have I ever played one on TV. But my understanding is that you ask for something, you get denied, and then you appeal it, right? That the appeal would be like the third stage. So tell me about this. These, if that's not wrong, what do these first two stages look like, where you ask for help and then they say no, and then you have to appeal it, or is that not what a FEMA appeal means?
No, you're not wrong. So the oddity is when there's a large loss event, meaning an event large enough where there's even a FEMA consideration, there are a number of forms of FEMA support, right? Public assistance is one. Ironically, that's not actually for the public. It is theoretically for like infrastructure response, immediate needs. It benefits the public, but it doesn't help an individual. There's another program called IA, or individual assistance, which is for individuals and households. And in that capacity, when there's a large loss event, generally people get sent to kind of a case management locale, whether that's a temporary evacuation point, a shelter, a DRC, a disaster recovery center, a LAC, a local assistance center. There's kind of an intake that comes with that. And as part of that, FEMA, once they are approved for an IA declaration, and now there's a lot of questions of what that will look like moving forward, but those individuals from FEMA do intakes, and the eligibility requirements are relatively straightforward. Like, you have to be 18 or older, you have to be a primary resident or lawfully in the United States, which poses some additional questions. It has to be your primary residence that was impacted, and that impact has to be due to the disaster. So most people end up registering regardless, because it's kind of part of the way that you're pushed through the system. Once you register, however, that doesn't really get you very far. So Congress, meaning federal Congress, right? They have rules and responsibilities and requirements to say, like, let's not create waste, let's not duplicate benefits. So people end up in a situation where if there's not enough documentation, if that documentation isn't completely completed, which, imagine like going to a local assistance center, your house just burned down, someone's asking you for your lease agreement, let alone title to your home and proof of your mortgage, and you're not going to have any of that, right? So
Right.
people generally register without having the backup information. And then FEMA, because of these congressional requirements, standardly denies you. And they've gotten a little bit better over the years, I will admit to that. But the denial feels like a permanent denial. The way that that verbiage is used, it's like, you're not eligible, rather than, hey, I just need some more details. I need some more documents, this kind of thing. Where that's why it's important to have an advocate or something. Because yes, you absolutely can appeal. Most people are rejected unless they really thought through their plan before anything happened, where they're like, let me run with my documents, my ID, my mortgage, my lease, my marriage license, my kids' immunization cards. I mean, all the things that we never think about keeping with us are really things that would be helpful in that situation. But most people don't. And I do not fault them for that, because you never think it's going to happen to you.
So I would imagine that there would be a pretty strong overlap between people who have a go bag and people who think this actually might happen to me. Because if you didn't think it was going to happen to you, right, you wouldn't make any preparations. So when we talk about, your toothbrush and your meds and your contact lenses and change of clothes and some drinking water, like, okay, if someone's following that list, then on the docs list, it should say, your passport or your green card or your driver's license, marriage certificate, divorce certificate, whatever it might be, right? Your lease, your home insurance, right? So you would want to have a copy of all those things. If not, in the go bag, then certainly online, accessible somewhere.
Yes. And I always honestly put this back on the person asking the question when they're in the disaster space. which is, Steve, what's in your go bag? Because ironically, a lot of us, even in this space, are not as prepared as we should be.
Mm-hmm. What's in my go bag? The class 3 items or less. Right.
Right.
Cash. What?
Right.
Right. Cash, food, armaments, passports, driver's license. And like many people, my go bag is in my automobile. So there's no issue of gathering stuff and having to put it in there. When you go to work, your car's there. When you go home, your car's there. So you're typically not far from your car if that's your go situation. And then, make sure your gas tank is never below halfway. And all the things that would generally make you prepared for most situations also render you go ready. Yeah, but I mean, a lot of people
But that's
don't
also
think.
part of the issue.
Explain?
That's also part of the issue in the sense that, when one thinks that has not been through a disaster or that isn't like looking at it through an advocate or legal lens, it's like, yeah, I need clothes, food, water, gas. Maybe they think of medication, right? But very few people think, oh, wait, let me get a copy of my lease. Let me get a copy of my mortgage. Let me get an entire copy of my insurance policy, right? Like there are so many documentation pieces of that question. Let me bring my passport that I don't even remember where it is because I haven't had the ability to travel recently, right? Like those consistent issues, let alone something simple like bringing an additional phone charger. So when you're in a crisis and you don't remember to pull that from your bedside, a lot of people would remember to bring their phone, but they're not going to remember to bring a charger, let alone their computer, things that can help in that space to complete a FEMA appeal. Even something as simple as like filing an insurance claim initially, right? Like if you don't know what your policy is, who your policy is held by, what your rights are in that given situation, you're suddenly like, well, wait, okay, I'm pretty sure that we used to have this company and now we changed because our kid was starting to drive. And, there's like a trajectory of that conversation that always happens internally in families. So having an understanding of really like what is needed, not just from a FEMA appeal standpoint, but to give you a bit of an understanding, at least when you start out, as to, okay, this is what I need to deal with. Like, for example, if I'm sure you've been a tenant in your life, right? Like at some point in time, at least I hope you have. But if you're a tenant, you don't go and think, okay, I need to make sure I know exactly how much my security deposit was. And if there's any, disaster related lease clauses in our contract, right? You're just like, thank God I got this place. I can afford it, kind of, and you kind of move from there. So when you're a tenant that's been displaced, it's like, well, wait a minute. Do I actually even know how to get a hold of my landlord? Like if there's a management company, yeah, probably, right? You'll at least remember them. You can look them up. But if it's like a private, like if you were my landlord and I was like, ooh, what's Steve's number? You know what I mean? Those are things that I think just aren't really thought through. And they all present legal issues. If you don't know how much money you paid for your security deposit, you're not going to know how much money is due to you. And similarly, in a disaster setting, your landlord likely also doesn't understand that that's not, that they can't, take away any of your security deposit. Their place has been destroyed. So regardless of what you did to it, unless you were the destructive force. But if
Right.
it's literally like a fire, flood, something's out of your control and it's deemed uninhabitable, there is a right in most states to stop the landlord-tenant agreement / lease contract and demand repayment of your security deposit, But a lot of people don't know that. And it's not, in most situations, some landlords, yes, but in most situations, the landlords actually just don't know what to do, which presents another legal issue. And it's the same with the insurance piece. When people file their insurance claim and they're like, okay, this is what happened. And the insurance company is like, okay, well, show us proof of your loss. Well, you're like, what do you want me to take pictures of a structure that's no longer there? The
Right.
reality is that's best met on the other side, right? Prior to, where you go in and you even just take like photos on your phone and put them on your emails, put them in the cloud. But it's like, this is what my house looked like. Let me open some drawers and show, like, the most important things that I have. So it's a bit easier to work through that process. People don't realize how challenging these pieces of the puzzle are going to be.
Yeah. And I would imagine when people are thinking back about, well, what did you lose in the fire? They vastly underestimate, the volume and the value of the things that they own.
Not just that, but it's also horribly emotional. Like a lot of our fire season in California, and this is true of Colorado, well, the West Coast to the, kind of Colorado borderline, it really does happen around the holidays. So there's a piece of the puzzle where you're already going through a lot emotionally for starters, but then you don't want to relive the things that were just changed, or the family photos, like all the sentimental pieces that come with the holidays. So if someone asks you, how many, photos did you lose? You're like, that's it. That seems like an unreasonable question, because they're not just photos to you. They're your life, they're your history, they're your story. That there's an odd piece to it that is a little sterile for the average human, and I would include myself in that.
I would
It's
imagine
just
that as we've seen our lives move to much more digital platforms, this idea of the family photo album, is probably on the cloud already, and
well,
probably
what's
started there,
weird?
right? What's that?
Pe- People always think that, but I will tell you, there are so many people, especially like from a multi-generational household, where they not only like have the family photo albums that, haven't been uploaded, but they also have like the sentimentality of things that actually are worth a lot of money, that maybe they didn't even know. It was like, this came from someone in my family. It's important to me. I've carried around with me that, they never saw it as an object worth a lot of money. I will say, though, that there are places like United Policyholders, which I'm sure you're familiar with, that can really kind of help give you those like high level highlights of like what you can do beforehand to make sure you're prepared. Well, I can't say make sure you're prepared. Disclaimer, you
To be more,
never fully
yeah,
but prepared more so than you would be without that information.
maybe we call it to be less unprepared.
Yes, that is a good way to perceive it, because that's really the reality.
It sounds, when you're talking about this FEMA appeals process and all of the things that you need to have in order to not start the day with that rejection letter. The complexity of it, it reminds me of a lot when, one of my kids needed an IEP and a 504 for special ed. And if you didn't know the law, you would get nothing from the school. And there was this book called Rights Law, and it explains what your rights are, what your kid's entitled to, what the school district is supposed to do. And if you don't know it, you're going to get none of it. And I'm wondering, like, if there's some equivalent maybe on your hard drive in process right now of a book that describes to people, what this process is for recovery from a disaster, and probably sections on, the left of bang side of the equation.
Yeah, I will say that's something that is a passion project of mine that I've been working on with some partners currently. There are some things out there in terms of like resources that can be helpful. like, United Policyholders website and the Disaster Legal Assistance Collaborative website, which we're attempting to improve. But the reality is, if you want like a whole full picture of the pieces of the puzzle you're going to run into, it's really challenging to develop that, which is why I think the disaster law is viewed as kind of a new thing. Like the firm Morrison and Forster used to publish this annual kind of, I'll call it a report for the sake of brevity, but it was like the biggest issues, you can run into, right? It's like employment, insurance, FEMA, SBA, Small Business Administration, for anyone that's not aware of that, construction contract issues. And suddenly that was kind of seen as a bit overwhelming for a lot of people because it is legally focused. But I will say, I've always given it to individuals without a law degree, and they have found that it's very helpful. The problem is kind of keeping things like that current in the same arena in which, the last disaster happened, right? So, you know, while that is amazing to do, it's really challenging to update it. This was something that recently happened in LA where like the FEMA rules had really changed, and we were working on updating a lot of these trainings and materials. But number one, that's not normally the time period in which that happens, because that disaster happened later, right? It was January. Normally we think of kind of like October is kind of the end date for fire season, which is no longer true. So we're trying to modify. But it was like, okay, on the ground, we have to modify this stuff, or people have to create it immediately, right? And then the second piece people run into is that there are a variety of issues that impact communities differently. So it depends on the type of disaster, for example, to start. But in addition, the smoke damage issue became a huge question in LA. And while it's not like LA is the first county impacted to deal with the smoke damage question, it was so much more central and focused, not just from an insurance standpoint, but also from a FEMA standpoint, that there just wasn't a lot of great material out there because it was kind of an emergent issue. Not in the sense that it hadn't occurred before, but in the sense that it was that widespread. And there wasn't a lot of well settled law on the issue or well settled regulations administratively, from a FEMA standpoint, or even from a Department of Insurance standpoint.
And when they're assessing, the original, damage assessment, they fly over with a helicopter and they count, how many slabs and how many homes, they'll say, oh, 13 homes were destroyed, or whatever the figure is, but they don't really have the ability, from the eye in the sky to say which homes are still habitable, because
No,
the smoke damage can render your home completely uninhabitable while not destroying, the structure of the home.
not at all. But even when, there's been there are a number of issues in this arena, but even like in Santa Cruz, for example, there were a number of people, and this was also true of Butte County, Paradise area, a number of people that kind of lived off the grid, where, they had a mobile or manufactured home on their parcel, or they had built a home on their parcel, and either the home had been there for a very long time, so the permits were not up to date. The permit understanding was not up to date with what actually existed, or the county assessor / reporter thought, oh well, nothing's here. This was just an empty parcel, and that wasn't true at all. So identifying that there is actually a place here, you lived here, just because you didn't pay a utility, like if you're fully on solar and you have a well and a pump, you don't really realize how much that can impact you, let alone if you inherited a home from, let's say, a great aunt or a grandparent, and it's been handed down, and you don't think, oh, okay, well, I have to make sure title's in my name. That's not something most people walk around thinking, oh, I got to do this, I got to do that, right? It's like, this has always been in my family. It's our home, right? Everyone has a right to this home in our family. But if it's not recorded, it presents a lot of problems and struggles that people have to deal with in terms of even being eligible for anything, right? Same with if you have an insurance policy that's not in your name. Like if you inherited a property from, your great aunt, and the policy says great aunt Millie and she's no longer with us. Well, if you're not a named person, that's going to present challenges for you that are different. So there are a lot of kind of weedy, for lack of a better term, issues that really impact the way people have the ability to respond. And the need for knowledge and support in that structure is extreme.
It sounds like this is an area where the unknown unknowns are much greater than the known unknowns.
Basically, kind of. I would like to think that I know the answer to a lot of questions, but I definitely don't know the answer to all of them, for starters. But also, I think it's a little more simplistic on some level. Until you're in that space, who would think about that? We don't want to wander around catastrophizing our lives, right? And I know it's, people always say this about like murder mysteries, right? Where they're like, you don't think that's going to happen in your town or to your family. But disasters are so much more pervasive than that we really do kind of need to start thinking about them differently. But there are really great things that people are doing in that space on a community-based level. I mean, creating, community organizations active in disaster, COADs or BOADs. There's a huge push to do neighbor to neighbor, where, you need to know who your neighbors are. If your neighbor down the street is not mobile and cannot help themselves and lives alone, I hope that, you or one of your other neighbors is going to pick them up, right? So part of this is legal, part of this is advocacy. And a lot of the advocacy piece to me is being able to advocate for yourself, being able to advocate for others, but also collective advocacy. Like there's so many people that find, so many survivors that find space in this arena to have conversations that are so meaningful. And it really just changes the way the conversation goes. Like last week, I was having a conversation with some service partners on the ground in LA, and talking about cases and clients and things. And without, revealing anything specific, there is kind of this consistent reality where survivors run into this space where they're like, well, if I want to have access to my insurance, I have to commit to rebuilding. But how do I commit to rebuilding if I don't know what my insurance company is going to pay me, right? Everyone starts out thinking, okay, well, I have, if you're insured, and you should be, hopefully, but if you own a home and your insurance, declaration page says that overall you could have X number of dollars, right? That doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get X number of dollars. And even if you have a right to it, which you do, I agree, it doesn't mean that you're going to get it in the fashion that you want it at. So if, especially for people that are underinsured, it becomes really problematic. Where if you have, a policy where your dwelling is covered for $500,000, good luck attempting to rebuild a home in California for $500,000. And unfortunately, that is becoming more and more true of more and more states. So that means you got to put your, dwelling combined with your personal property, combined with your other structures, with an additional hope that you'll find some gap financing or can afford an additional loan. And that's just not really feasible for an immediate solution, right? So finding or being creative in situations like that, I have found, can be really helpful for people. Like, if you are not getting access to the benefits you are contractually entitled to on your declaration page, had a total loss. We don't have questions here, right? It's just general standard situation information kind of thing. Then file a complaint with the Department of Insurance, which in California we call a request for assistance, but let them know. And that's helpful for a number of reasons. One is it helps the Department of Insurance track bad actors, but two, it also presents an opportunity where the insurance company has to explain to the Department of Insurance why either you're wrong and they're not required to give this to you for whatever reason, or they have to say, well, it's not that we won't, it's that, so it just adds a bit of additional pressure to kind of force a resolution. And I know that's kind of a simplistic way to look at it. I know for most people it's much harder than that, but I hate to see how many people that, especially that are underinsured, are put in a position where they can't get access to their full benefits. And in addition, even if they did, they would have a hard time rebuilding, and then being put in a situation where they either can't get legal support because it's really not a smart business decision for a lot of private firms in certain situations when there's not a lot of money involved, or it presents a non-contractual issue. Like, they're not saying they'll never pay you, they're saying they won't pay you immediately. But I completely understand if someone said, hey, Kendall, I'll give you $1 million, you get to build whatever house you want, I would be stoked. That's not the situation survivors are in. No one chose this. No one chose to have to build a house, period, let alone have people think that, $1 million is suddenly a lot of money. I'm not saying it isn't, but it isn't a lot of money to rebuild a house. That's just the reality, especially not in that competitive of an environment.
Right. I imagine that competitive aspect is huge, right? That if one house in my neighborhood burns down, the cost of replacing that is going to be pretty much what it is. If all the houses burn down and there's only so many contractors, then there's only so much Home Depot and Lowe's to go around. I would imagine the cost of rebuilding goes up considerably with that demand.
Yes, absolutely. And oddly, price gouging in theory is illegal, right? You're not supposed to take a disaster situation for your benefit as a provider of a good or service when there is an actual disaster declaration in effect, right? But realistically, there's this other piece to it when it comes to construction and construction materials, which is the price gouging protects to a certain level, but A, it's hard to track, right? B, it's really challenging to identify, like, who is the bad actor. Is it the general contractor? Is it the subcontractor? Is it the person selling the lumber? Is it the person selling the nails? Like, suddenly there are so many pieces to the puzzle that it's kind of impossible to get like a really clear understanding of it unless you can say, hey, I know Steve just built the same house I want to build, and he just got to build that for X number of dollars a square feet. And now you're telling me I can't do it for Y. What's your reason? And do they have a good one, right? But that's not really how construction works. So in that space, I always encourage people, like, use the CSLB, the Contractor State Licensing Board. Like, not only make sure that the individual you're working with has a license, but also that they have some tie to the community. Why are they there? Why do they want to rebuild? Is this purely financial, or is there literally a space where they're like, this is what I do, this is why I want to do it? And I will tell you, there are a lot of builders that do come in from out of town, some of which are not good, but others of which are like, hey, this is what I do. I know that this town cannot do this effectively, and we have the financial capacity to absorb a number of builds at one time. And that is a huge benefit. But if you don't know that, if you haven't had those conversations, you don't know the financial stability of the company, you're in a precarious space because there are so many pieces of that puzzle, especially for people that are underinsured, where it's like, okay, well, I'm going to rebuild this. And then, they kind of get taken advantage of, or the company that they're working with, even some with the best of intentions, right? They're not setting out to be bad people. They think they can accomplish this, but they bite off a bit more than they can chew. And it ends up that they can't actually float the cost of numerous rebuilds at one given time. So suddenly these companies start to fold, and it presents really significant challenges, because what other contractor wants to, first of all, how much money is left, right? But second of all, no other contractor wants to come in and take on full liability for a job that they weren't a participant in. And that's essentially what's required, for a good reason. I'm not arguing with that law, but it does present a challenge.
Fascinating. Well, one thing I'm really glad about, Kendall, is that I've already got a next interview set up with you, because there's so much more to dive into on this. So I can't thank you enough for introducing this field and sharing all that you've shared and joining us on the show today.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I think we have a book in us, and I would also encourage anyone that's listening, if you guys have questions you want to bring up, I'm sure Steve can share how they can be shared, because I find that having questions in a forum space is always a really great way of just improving this disaster response space from an iterative standpoint. So thank you so much, Steve, and anyone who's listening.
You bet. And for folks who want to get in touch with you and pick your brain a little bit, or maybe even, pay a retainer, what's the best way to get in touch with you, Kendall?
You can email me at kendalljarvislaw.com. You see I don't know if they can see my name, but it's KENDALLJARVISLAW@gmail.com.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Kendall. And I'll put a link with this post. Thanks so much for illuminating this field so well. And we're definitely going to follow up with a couple more interviews this month, because it's such an important topic. Thank you all for listening and joining me on another episode of The Fire Break. I'm Steve Wolf, responsible by Team Wildfire. Check us out on the web at teamwildfire.com. Until I see you next time, take Kendall's advice, walk around your home with a camera and do one of those silly vlog things, but focus on showing us what's in every drawer, what's in your safe, etc. You might not want to post that online, but certainly have it available to you so that you've got it to work with your insurance company. Thanks so much, and we'll see you at the next one. Take care.